to begin.
Hey, welcome back here. Adventures in Torah again. And this is going to be a very interesting adventure because he's still battling serious coughing.
I'm still battling some...
And you can hear it. So
it's not been fun.
No. Covet prayers, actually, with regard to health and healing and wholeness here, for certain. It's a bit of a struggle. But we're in the portion Mishpatim. All right, Mishpatim. Yeah, Mishpatim. And if we look at our things, right. Where are we at? Exodus 21. All right, we just came out of. We're still here, right at the mountain. You know, we have the giving of the 10 Commandments, and Mishpatim.
Now these are the rules.
Rules. Yep, that's how the ESV.
Is that it?
Rules. Yeah.
Judgments,
I think, is another or the instructions. But they're very specific though. Mishpatim is laws, if you will, because we're kicking off in major serious instruction.
We are. And
it is serious instruction that's going to be put forth. In fact, this particular portion, if I'm not mistaken, is like 52 or 53 commands. It's the most heavy-laden portion of number of commandments.
Yeah. And it's divided into 2 primary sections. There's a little bit of the religious, but that's mainly say for Leviticus, but we're dealing with the social. Oh, yeah. We're dealing with the criminal aspects and the
whole wide
civil
range.
Aspects and things of that nature.
It's kicking off the actual instructions on how this group of folks is supposed to begin living
their life. And that's really pretty neat.
It's fascinating.
Why don't you open up with a word of prayer?
That'd be wise. Here, let's do. Well, our Father and our King, we once again bless you and thank you for this opportunity that we can just sit down and have a moment of discussion of your word, and dialogue about your mishpatim, your judgments, your guidance, your wisdom, your laws. Father, we count it a privilege to be able to do this, and we take it as this adventure of learning of you, because there is no separation of your word, your laws, and who you are. It's a revealing of you. So that's why we want to delve into this, so we can get to know you. And we're going to come across spots, Father, I know, where we're going to be asking the question, what is it? And we look to you for answers on that. We do ask for your healing hand and peace on Kev here as we plow through this. Help reduce the coughing. It'd be great. We love you, Lord. Thank you for this chance. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, now these are the rules, the judgments that you shall set before them. This is the Lord speaking to Moses. This is the rules. And right off the bat, this is why I like verse 2, I go, when you buy a Hebrew slave.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it?
I'm like, what?
So we're dealing automatically with a unique social construct that we have no real familiarity with whatsoever.
No.
You know,
even when we use the term slave and things like that, total different construct of what is in the United States was considered, slavery within it. That's a total different dynamic, but there's crossover similarities. We're talking like, okay, is this just an employee? Is this somebody that actually owned? Because there's spots later where it says, they're property. They are property. They're considered, but that's a temporary state. Yeah, it's not a permanent state, because there is no slave other than a bonded slave that is voluntarily, giving himself to his master. No slave exceeds a 6-year limit. Yeah, and that's what it goes to. When what got me though is when you have Hebrew slave, they're like, these are brothers, if you will. They're all ultimately related, obviously multiple generations things going here, but shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. In other words, it's just a time period of servitude. Now, why that ends up functioning that way, that capacity? Well, we do learn later on that this was a key aspect of being able to raise funds to be able to pay off debts. If you ended up being in debt, destitute, indentured servitude basically is what it is. And
you also had the ability to sell your son or your daughter as well.
It's just so bizarre.
It is bizarre.
Hearing it that way,
and
whatever.
You can sell yourself.
Right. To be able to say, hey, then in that regard, it almost is like more of an employee-employer relationship. That's what it seems like on there, but because there's a financial transaction. If you think about it, when you go to work for somebody, they're paying you money for a service or whatever. Now, the element you don't equate that with ownership of them owning you for a season. But in one sense, it kind of is.
Yeah.
I know, as being a self-employed individual, when I'm working, I feel owned by certain business things for certain. I'm doing whatever it takes. Yeah.
It is a unique situation.
Yeah, that dynamic. Thing that I know as I was going through this portion, because this is literally, we have the 10 words that have just come forth, whatever, but it just immediately, pedal to the metal, starts listing out stuff.
Well, one of the things that we didn't get to last week, so you have the commandments that have been given, the 10 Commandments, chapter 20. Mm-hmm. Right after that, and we made mention of it, but we never really talked about it.
That's true, we didn't get to it.
Before the remainder of the law is given, you had two things. One, the people had to first be redeemed before the law is given.
Mm-hmm. And which that transpired 49 days.
The law is received. Yeah. However you want to look at it.
It's both ways. It was really given that one point in time, but if you look at it in the sense, it's received daily from that point on.
But before anything else is given, God automatically, right up front, makes provision. Mm-hmm. Provision is made, and we find that for not being able to keep the law.
Oh, yeah.
And we find that in chapter...
But that wasn't the goal.
No.
In other words, the command is to be able to do, but knowing the weakness of human.
We would fall short. Yeah. Adam and Eve fell short. Everybody has fallen short. Mm-hmm. So the provision that was made is in chapter 20, starting in verse 22, pertaining to the altar. See, this is grace that's being given, intermingled with the law. But they never received the law until they first received redemption.
Right.
Isn't that interesting?
Oh, yeah. That is the reality of that is to be the pattern of our life, too, there as we come to a recognition of going, okay, there is God, creator and stuff, and our heart needs to be coming to him and recognizing that, and then being, okay, he's a creator. We need to follow what creator is saying instead of going on my own way. Yeah. In that recognition, though, he's provided redemption to be able to come in there. And then, but that's not the end of our part. Then we begin learning and follow this same pattern. Redemption.
I like the way you put that, and it just triggered a little bit more of a thought in that, redemption's provided first, then we have the giving of the 10 Commandments, then we have the altar, and it's like the continuation of redemption. It's a perpetual state, if you will.
Yes.
And
so verse 24, an altar of the earth you shall make for me and sacrifice on it the burnt offerings and your peace offerings for your sheep and your oxen. So it lays right in there prior to the pedal to the metal of the giving of of the communication.
Yeah. Because my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you.
Yes.
See, and this is what we find. This is what we find that he wants to bless us. We like to look at the law as the burden. It's the noose around our neck. It's not.
But it's not.
But it's not. And when we drive down the road, we have laws for getting from point A to point B. To include don't text and drive.
Right. There's actually a lot that are actually there.
Is that a noose around my neck?
Or is it a guide?
Or is it keeping me safe from the idiot that's going to want to text and drive and then run into me and do my property damage, send me to the hospital, my kids, my wife, whatever? Yeah. It's meant to keep us as a society safe. That law is required
In fact, right there
for safe function.
That word is of being safe is a critical one there of protecting and things, because later in Galatians, Paul's in this dialogue with regard to elements in there, and one of the things he talks about is being it references the law being a tutor, being something, but it's also referenced it, and some translations make it sound like it's something onerous of being like jailed. But that word gives a total wrong thing, because it's actually something to be surrounded by to protect.
Without law, there's no freedom.
Yeah,
that's the dichotomy. That's the yin. If there's no law, there's no freedom. Chances of me making it from my house to your house is slim to none without law. But I have the freedom to make it here safely because of the law. Now, we can take laws to extreme, that's for sure. And like speed traps and stuff like that.
And you can cause things to become, the terminology is legalistic. That's a different thing from, it's taking a thing and pushing it beyond even what the Lord...
like all the regulations that were built up where companies can't operate anymore because they're being so bound up they can't function.
Can't even function.
They can't invest in themselves or in their communities because of that's the onerous part. But God doesn't go down that road.
No, He really doesn't.
He really doesn't.
No, the element
we
there...
do,
we do. Exactly. I was just going to say, that's what so much transpired.
We call that the fences around the law. Yeah. That's where the traditions come in, to keep us from approaching breaking the law. Right. And in so doing, it becomes extremely onerous and unable to function freely at all.
Exactly right.
All right, let's go on.
Okay, there is so much that is in the course, but there's like you said, it's broken up into in this portion multiple areas of things, but it is dealing with interpersonal relationships with people and with the plan of them going into the land, going into Canaan, going into these
objective.
Right. This is the promise that they're going to be going into this land. And we're both coughing here. The nations that were around and how extreme in their behavior, offensive behavior. There's some very things in this portion, whatever, that that's kind of like pretty raw things. It's like it even hits spots or whatever of prohibition with regard to sex with animals. When you come across that, like, what the?
Believe it or not, that was actually a common practice amongst the Canaanite people.
Yeah, isn't that wild?
That was part of their covenant of iniquity was not yet completely full.
Which is wild.
It was a common practice.
Yeah.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. But then, because then sometimes you look at things like, well, how in the world would they just wipe out these people, beforehand to remove them? It says the level of degradation that had reached on there, it was that. It had to be removed.
Absolutely.
So that, but there's another portion in the portion that sometimes people get tripped up on. Have you ever come across this, where you start having certain things happen, like example that they have through here is an incident where you have an ox or whatever, and this ox was known to gore somebody or to be unruly thing itself, whatever, and those things, and then the responsibility, whose responsibility it ended up being, to do stuff. It was the owner, if a neighbor was borrowing the thing or whatever. Yeah. You have all these little incidences, but it comes across in a passage of thing it comes to in 23. It says, "But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life." And then you have the great lines in verse 24: "Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." And so you hear that line quoted many times. I know when you hit... Alrighty, we hit the spot where they have all the incidents of things occurring.
Okay.
But this passage that they've heard many times, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth.
Yeah.
Okay. Of which most of the time people quote that in the context of being negative toward, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, thing like that. There's like this judgment thing going on. But the heart of that being communicated is just an element of responsibility. It's not that if I poke your eye out, you're supposed to poke my eye out. That's not what's being communicated. If do something or other to you, I have to recompense you for the damages that were done. Right.
Yeah.
In other words, then that ends up coming, though, to...
commensurate with the offense.
Right. Now, you do the element of murder, where somebody actually plans and takes the life of somebody, murder, whatever, then you have forfeited your life in that way, is what literally the Lord communicates that.
Absolutely.
Which is like, whoa, but that's a reality. Now, if it's accidental...
that's different.
Right.
And we have several different types of provisions that are made available for accidental death.
Yeah.
You know, and one of them is sanctuary cities.
Interestingly enough, that is that.
How many sanctuary cities in total was there in
Israel?
Israel?
Gosh,
20
something of that nature. Honestly, we'll come across it.
I can't remember.
We'll come across that when it gets listed out
there.
And
they could go free when the high priest had died.
Yeah. It had a certain time period on there.
I think we'll get into that.
Which is fascinating, yeah. But setting up, that's one of the things. This is all setting up a particular culture to function within in there. Now, how does that apply to us and things? You know, these things that are applicable. Because reality is, when you come to the words of God here, the laws being instructed, whatever, it really is a revelation of who He is. Jesus himself said He is the Word. It ate flesh, you know.
In flesh, and He tabernacled amongst us. We'll be getting to that next week.
And that element, though, when you come across some of these, you have to look at them not just at that first level. You do look at it at a first level of things, seeing what's being communicated, because some of it just makes that makes good sense. You know, it does. You hit some of them like, But how does it apply? Like, well, I don't own an ox. I'm not going to gore something. I do own dogs.
That will run out.
That will could cause some issues like that, and that I'm responsible for that. You know, there's elements, but it is an element of teaching.
Such as Daisy scratching through the wall.
Oh, there we go. Yes, the responsibility.
There's a responsibility there.
It needs to be repaired. Exactly. But that is...
We did find an application.
We did. A direct one. The details of there, it's funny because it does go into some that are very detailed and some are very general. I always get tickled by the detail. Like if when a man strikes the eye of a slave and the male female destroys it, says lets the slave go free because of the damaged eye. He knocks out a tooth, he goes free. I could just see somebody whenever claws on normal tooth out. But anyway, it's basically being compensating appropriately. That's one of the bigger elements. And then we end up going to the whole thing with the...
In verse 33, we have the fellow that digs a pit.
Yes.
But then he doesn't take responsibility for digging the pit, and he doesn't... And others fall in, and they get hurt. You know, he does, and when we're talking back in that day, they used to dig what's called cisterns.
Yeah.
And it was to collect the rainwater and all that because water was hard to come by. But they were required to take appropriate measures to safeguard somebody that's walking by not to fall in the pit and break their leg. And then now they got to spend time getting well. They lose wages, all of these kind of things because the neighbor was negligent in his responsibility for digging the pit.
And you notice something, too, on here, example, the recompense. There will be an actual multiplication of stuff. Like here it says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 times for an ox, 4 times for the sheep. Now, how those numbers came to pass, who knows? I don't know. But it's very specific, though. It's going to be, you steal this ox or whatever thing, then something happens to that, you're going to have to pay back who you stole it from 5 times.
This is the criminal law, and then we have the civil law. You know how I interact with you and how you interact with me. You know.
But as you press through all these, it's just fascinating to see. But a lot of times when you come to these things, it's easy to pass them over quickly. You don't spend time on it because you feel like, well, I don't have cattle, I don't have sheep, I don't have things on there. Yet the principle that God is communicating things are fully applicable.
Absolutely.
They really, really are.
Absolutely. You know, the biggest deal is taking responsibility. What we were talking about with the ox, how does that apply today? Well, one of the things I was trying to teach one of my sons was, you know, I have a massive amount of tools, and he wanted to borrow some of them to do a project.
Yeah.
He lost a couple of them. And he didn't think that it was really necessary to make sure that I get my tools back. And a friend of mine, Ed, was over when that happened, and you know, both of us were like, you don't get to eat, you don't get to do anything, you don't get to buy gas for your car, you don't get to, until that tool is replaced. You get to do nothing.
So
and of course they have to have gas for the car to get to work.
Yeah, or go replace it. Right.
So there is, you know, common sense applies, but no, you don't get to go to the movie. You owe me a $140 tool. You don't get to go out on a date. You owe me a $140 tool. And it was several of them. And that comes before anything else. And he finally learned that lesson. And what do you know? It took some time. It did. But it's a very important lesson to learn.
In verse 9, just as an example right here, for every breach of trust.
That's interesting.
Go
ahead and expound
on
that.
That's the element. That will just caught the attention. Every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a tool, a cloak, any kind of lost thing, of which one says, this is it. The case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. So this is a breach of trust between individuals.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because that is something that's fully applicable every day of your life of things, and that's the
let your yes be yes and your no be no. Yeah.
Definitely so. I just find that embedding, that's one of the imports of things. You don't come across this, oh gosh, it's talking about slaves, talking about cows, it's talking about oxen. No, within this is so, that's what I'm just trying to make the point, how important the principles that are being taught through here. Because it's fun, though, it does go on, and our time is slipping. But big element of it is things of restitution. You know, just restoring things to the owner. And it goes into details, which are it's actually real handy. But interesting enough, it doesn't necessarily go into all details on there. Example being, when it gives example like the digging of a pit, okay, anything applicable to any sort of building, doing something of that nature that could have the potential of causing harm to somebody else, it's your responsibility to make sure that's protected. I mean, people that... I think there's another spot making a parapet, on a second floor, building something around it to make sure so nobody falls off it.
It's required to put railing up.
Yeah.
Boom. That's just that simple.
I know. Which when you look at it, it's like, does that have to be really communicated? Well, it is. It is communicated by the Lord there, but it's purposeful also, not just saying, oh yeah, well I'm supposed to build this fence thing here. It's purposeful in communicating to our lives and how we're to take responsibility for others.
I like the way you just put that right there.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
It is. It's incumbent upon us to be thoughtful for others, to help protect them, to have elements of life. Now, when you, Okay.
I think you can continue now.
All right.
That's a good point you're making. Go.
Well, that's the element of responsibility. That's an element I'm trying to get with regard to takeaway of within our own, obviously, family, our responsibilities there, but even outside our families of just making sure that we're being conscious of that. And that actually comes into the fullness of later on where it talks about, it says, the love for your neighbor ends up being the fulfillment of the Torah, ends up being that fulfillment. Why? Because the motivation of there is to protect, to care for, to be insightful for,
That's good stuff right there.
I think it is.
That's really good stuff, Well, then who is my neighbor?
Yes, yeah. All right. Yeah. And it's not end up being, because there's those that end up going, well, my neighbor ends up being just, whoever's next door to me, or is it somebody just within my direct relation that I know? Jesus made a really, really good parable with regard to who my neighbor
is. And
is.
ultimately what it boiled down to was, if my sphere comes in contact with your sphere, you're my neighbor.
You're my neighbor.
If my sphere doesn't come in contact with your sphere, then you're not my neighbor until it does. But when it does...
And even in there, though, you can then, where you're at, be purposeful to go into other people's spheres.
Yeah.
And that ends up being, because that's an incumbent thing of us to go.
Yeah.
To reach into other people's spheres.
It's
a good way to put that, though.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to be responsible for somebody that you've never had contact with. I mean, when he was passing by, when the Samaritan was passing by and he saw the man beaten and bruised, his sphere just came in contact.
He saw it, yes.
Yeah. And at that time, it became incumbent upon him to take some type of action,
And it's so interesting how we had the various ones, because they had legitimate reasons.
Yeah. Yes, they did.
They really did, because it's a particular one. It could have been a priest going along, whatever. It says, I'm supposed to be serving, and if I come in contact, I will become unable to serve.
Yeah.
But
ceremonially unclean.
Right, ceremonially unclean. But the reality is, God's actual priority of life always takes precedent.
There's a higher priority than your ceremonial uncleanliness. And that is
it
to take care of your...
It doesn't negate the ceremonial. Yeah. It doesn't negate it.
It supersedes it.
Right. It does. It supersedes the thing, because who's the one that gave the ceremonial aspects of being able to serve before the altar?
Exactly.
The Lord did on there. Yet there's a higher level of things. It's not negating those things, but there are time periods it has to set that aside to take care of an immediate need.
And he talks about that in regard to if an ox falls into a pit, or if your donkey falls into a pit, and it just so happens to be
on Shabbat. Yeah, exactly.
Well, guess what? You don't let that donkey or that ox die.
Right.
You get together, your team, and you pull that baby out of there, whether it's Shabbat or not.
Right.
Period.
Exactly. It deals with the priority of things. Does that negate that, well, then we don't have to keep Shabbat on there?
No.
No, that's not the point.
And then it talked about, I like the one where, King David breaks into the temple, or into the tabernacle, and raids the food or the showbread because he thinks he's about to die. And God says it's okay.
Yeah.
Normally that's not allowed.
No. In fact, you do run into instances where you're like, oh my gosh, well, how did this one not qualify in there? And those ends up being matters of heart, of which we don't have privilege to. Thankfully. So, it is so fascinating throughout this whole portion, though, because you just start beginning laying out stuff. We have reiteration of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
Well, you have reiteration things, like you have 6 days you shall work, on the 7th day you shall rest, and everything. And I like this part too, because it adds in here that your ox, your donkey may have rest, son of your servant woman, and the alien, they may be refreshed.
Yeah.
There's a physical aspect of it that is beneficial, but there's also a deeper level of a spiritual aspect in every one of the commandments.
Yeah. There's 2 things I wanted to point out before we close.
Oh, yeah, we are down to it.
We're coming down, but in chapter 23, in verse 6, it says, "You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, okay? And do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. I will not excuse them."
No.
He says, and then he goes on in verse 8, and you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted, and it subverts the cause of those who are in the right. And it finishes by saying this, and you shall not oppress the sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt.
Yes.
And that,
that is huge right there. Absolutely. I love the fact here it says that a bribe blinds the clear-sighted. In other words, you're clear-sighted, but in this process, it becomes a blinder. to what needs to go on to submerge it.
Now, you can't see how that's applicable for today. I mean, with everything that's going on.
Yeah, think about that.
You know,
yes.
Holy cow. And there's one last thing I wanted to just touch on. I got to find it again.
Well, you're looking for that. I'm going to mention in the further in 23:14, we have the first laying out then of the Moedim being requested.
We have three
times.
7
yeah, 3 times
being
a year.
Given.
You shall have a Moedim feast to me. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread as I commanded you. And we have that. So it begins to so it's reiterating what we just went through. Yeah. It's laying down. Hey, so this is going to be something that's going to be commemorated.
And exactly. The 3 that are mentioned are the 3 that they've already participated in. They don't know anything about the
in gathering yet. We don't have in gathering yet, but you keep the feast of gathering at the end of the year because we're started in there. But 3 times all your males are to appear before the Lord.
Yeah,
which is cool.
So I found this. This is the last. The last thing is this in verse 20. It says, "Behold, I send an angel before you."
Yes.
I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Listen to this. Pay careful attention to him. Yes. Him, and obey his voice.
Yes.
Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression. For listen, the close of this,
I know.
My name is in him.
Yeah.
Isn't that phenomenal?
It is. It's so because it even continues on. Because he says, carefully obey his voice. Do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your and an adversary to your adversaries. He's going to be fighting for...
You know, we talk about the cloud and the fire, the pillar of fire by night, and the cloud, the pillar of fire. That's who he's talking about. Do not offend that pillar at all.
So
my name, that's not just a cloud of smoke. That's not just a pillar of fire. My name is in, and then he makes it personal, in him, not in it.
Right.
It is in him. So this is a manifestation whose name is God.
Fascinating, isn't it? Makes you wonder because interestingly, being referenced as a messenger and then translated as an angel, and there because representation of who that is. Immediately, most of the time, a Christian viewpoint was as well. Is that Jesus? You know, it's obviously the Lord, but the ancient Hebrew Kabbalists, if you will, they actually have what the heck was that? They have a name for that angel. Metatron.
Okay.
Metatron is the name. Now,
Megatron.
I know that's what I thought too when I first heard it. That's Megatron. Like that, we got the Transformer all of a sudden. That's Metatron. It is the word of the. I'm like, where did that come from? And that's not. It's totally outside of the text.
What we're seeing right here is we're seeing the pluralistic nature of God. That's the other aspect of it, because you have God talking to Moses, talking about himself in the third person over here,
listening to him.
And we get to see the pluralistic nature of God.
Elohim,
You know,
definitely. And he can manifest anywhere, any way he so pleases.
Yes, he can. He manifested in the burning bush. You know, and he's manifesting here as well.
He's definitely other
than, and here's the thing. God is talking to Moses up on the mountain right now.
Yeah.
So Moses is receiving this. But what's going on down below at the same time during this 40 days of absence? And what's God, he will not,
Yeah.
And we're going to see that in action.
Yeah.
It's a scary thing. We take God so for granted sometimes that I can do whatever I want to do, ask forgiveness.
Yes.
And everything's cool and kosher and everything. Yes, God is able to forgive and he's willing to forgive, and he's made the ability for that forgiveness to come into full light in your life. But sometimes when a deed is done, there's no undoing it. You know, like they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They were inheritors of the promise, but they were never allowed to inherit. They were promised that they could, but they rejected their inheritance, and it was the second generation that was allowed to inherit. Well, the first generation was still God's people, but due to their choices in life, they, and we're talking about Kadesh Barnea specifically, they were banned from inheriting the promise, even though they're still God's people. We need to understand that. Sometimes when we do something, yes, He's faithful to forgive us and cleanse us of all of our unrighteousness. But sometimes when a deed is done, the deed is done. And because we are not careful as to not offend Him, and we take it so flippantly, you know, our relationship with the Lord, sometimes there is no going back. You just have to deal with where you're at now.
Yeah, that's truth. And we need to finish on that.
All right, it's time to close it out.
Are you able to close in prayer?
All right, I'll give it a try.
Give it a try. Okay.
Lord, we thank you, Jesus, for this day. We thank you that we're able to come together and to talk about your word. Your law that is given is not a favorite topic for most people by any stretch of the imagination, but the understanding that your law has been given to keep us safe and to keep us on the straight and narrow path is an essential thing that we need to learn and that we need to understand. It's for our protection. And it's so that we can walk in a close relationship with you. It's not that the law has the ability to provide righteousness, but it keeps us true to you, and it keeps us true to each other. We just ask that you go before and that you minister to the hearts and minds of people that are listening right now. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah.
I was able to say it that time.
That was good.
All right.